I've been thinking carefully about how we relate with technologies that we use all the time, like language, which we don't usually think of as a technology, but it's the fundamental technology. We have knowledge, which is sort of a record of things we've learned both with and beyond language. And then images, which are another kind of record, and particularly the internet and electronic social technology. But before I do, I'd like you to do a thought experiment with me. I'd like you to just imagine for a moment that you're standing in a forest, one that you can remember. Let's take a moment and imagine that you're standing in the forest in the afternoon, and you can smell the sense of the forest in the air. Perhaps you even hear animals that you are familiar with from that place that you know. And if you don't know of a place, you can just imagine one. And try to see it really vividly in your mind's eye or in your imagination. However it is you may see it, whether an image comes or not, just imagine that forest and walking perhaps on a trail in the forest and the crunch of the forest floor beneath your feet, or the soil, feel of the soil, sound of any of the animals or birds that may be nearby, the bright afternoon sun, the colors, the feeling of the sun reflecting off of living things onto your body. Imagine that feeling. Imagine that feeling of being not just in light, but in light that is only being reflected back at you by living things only, and nothing else. Imagine that feeling. Imagine how good that might feel. And imagine that perhaps you hear a little stream, a bubbling stream of water somewhere nearby. You may even be able to see a hint of it somewhere nearby in your imagining. It's a beautiful thing. Now let's come back to my regular talk. Thank you for going with me. I enjoyed imagining that with you. See, that's very different from being shown a picture, isn't it? Because imagination is a faculty. And when we force an image on that faculty, something happens. Now, we don't tend to value the imagination as highly as I think we should in our cultures and in our talk about it. Most of us have, upon sharing something that we found very astonishing or anomalous about our own experience, we've been told by our parents or by some other authority, oh, well, that's just your imagination. Just? Oh, really? Was that just my imagination? That's interesting. Because if that's the case, would it be just your imagination that allowed you to notice, frame, compose, speak, and understand that communications gesture? Because if it was, well, that just your imagination is just about everything, isn't it? So what happens when we force images on it? Do we even stop to ask this question? And then what is the cost of our relationship with images? Both, well, not just both, but what is the cost intellectually? What is it in terms of the development and power that we might experience with our imagination? What is it relationally? What is it socially? And of more and more importance, what is it environmentally? What does taking pictures mean? What does viewing pictures do? These are some of the things I want to talk about in ways that aren't that common. I'm sure that in some areas of philosophy and discussion they've been looked at. I've rarely encountered them myself, but I don't believe that the thoughts that I'm going to share with you are incredibly novel. I think they are perhaps, though, very important, and they're being ignored. We need to somehow find a way to make them common. So I'm going to talk a lot about pictures and our relationships with them, and a few related ideas. Some years ago, I was able to visit an aquarium after not having been able to go for many years, say 5 or 6 years, and it was during the upsurge in the common use of cell phones, which I do not own a cell phone, by the way. In fact, I'm a technology consultant, a computer specialist who built networks here in the 1980s and 90s here in San Francisco. And I'm very conversant with technology, but I'm also very cautious about it. I've been working with computers since their onset in the early 80s, and I've been teaching people how to use them since about that time. And so I watched the birth both of BBSs, which were kind of the precursor to the internet, and the internet. And I helped publishing companies and other companies build networks and interface with the internet and use those assets effectively. When I used to do that professionally, I no longer do. It's been many years since I've been doing that professionally. Some years ago, I went to the aquarium, and I'd been absent from it for quite some time, over 5 or 6 years, and I don't own a cell phone. It's one of the technologies I've avoided. And I've not been out in public that much. I've been rather isolated. And so, for reasons beyond my control. So when I went to the aquarium that day, I was very surprised to see people following their cell phones around. Not just a few people, everybody. In fact, I would say that 98% of the people were not present. They were following their hand, a lit device in their hand around. Now, I was in awe of all of the creatures and of the changes in the aquarium. And I was having a very confusing experience because I was divided between trying to understand what the other human beings were doing and my own experience of the living things there, of the light reflecting off the living things back into my own eyes, directly right off of them into my eyes, not into a machine and then into my eyes, or into a machine and then into electronic representations and then into thousands of my friends' eyes all over the internet or something like that. No, just into my eyes, the living light. So I was confused and frightened, actually. I thought, I've never seen anything like this. Are these people really human? What are they doing? I wanted to do something about it, actually. I felt that I should intervene. What ended up happening was that another man somewhat near my age noticed that we were the only two people not following our hand demons around the nature museum. And he came over and we struck up a conversation. That event shook me. We had a nice conversation. We didn't mention the people with the phones too much. It was obvious. It was so obvious we didn't require that we notice it. We just talked about the living things and our interest in them and our experiences of them. I had a wonderful time there that day, but I was very confused by the cell phone situation. Now, over the past 10 years, our relationship with photography has radically changed. Everyone is taking photographs of everything, and we're all storing and transmitting them, and they have become, in fact, the objects and subjects of our nurture and attention. We nurture collections of images. We collect images en masse, and we transmit, share, back up, print, and otherwise manipulate them constantly. This has ramifications we've not been examining. Some for our imagination, and some for nature and the things that we are photographing. I used to play a text game. I'll tell a little story here. I used to play a text game, and in this game you had to imagine the place where you were based on a very small amount of a text description. Sounds like a crazy idea, but over time I learned how to map the entire terrain. I had an imaginary world in my mind with all of the characters and creatures, objects, and places of this imaginary world existing in a kind of hypostasis in my mind. And the game became more of a catalyst than the actual object. The object was that I was getting a whole new imagination, because instead of being fed images, I was having to make them myself based on very slender text descriptions. So what happened in my mind was that the imaginal analog of all of those linked up text descriptions created almost a living world. And it transformed my imagination, this experience, quite dramatically. So that when I went back into nature, I had a very different mind, a radically different mind, an unexpectedly observant and intelligent mind that didn't even seem to be my own. It was as if something had remade it just from playing a text-based game. Now, a video game is really the opposite thing. It imposes images on your imagination. I don't want to be too crude or too hyperbolic, but when this is overdone, it really is a form of rape. It's a form of overstimulation that is rapacious in that it has two essential effects. The first is it overstimulates the imagination, and that creates a problem where now the imagination can't be easily stimulated. 3 or 4 words is unthinkably unstimulating to an imagination that has seen images so florid and astonishing that it could never make their like on the fly on its own. Well, it's actually untrue. In fact, even the simplest image in your imagination is more valuable and astonishing than all the printed and photographed images ever made on Earth. But we forget that. We forget how precious a faculty. In fact, we forget that our imagination is perhaps the source of faculties. So what happens when we cram images into it? You know, a friend of mine mentioned that during the onset of puberty in childhood, and of course there are many other examples of this besides the rather provocative one that I'm about to mention, but during the onset of puberty in childhood, or in teenhood, late childhood and teens, we may find with any children that are or teens that are sexually stimulating themselves, they may be using their imaginations in incredibly flamboyant and florid ways to produce the results that they're hoping to get, whatever those may be. And my friend, who's a very astute observer of both human intelligence and minds, highlighted the fact that this is a very powerful training for the visualization assets, and that these are crucially important to every aspect of what it means to be human and to exist in nature and to pursue our own education and intelligence. Our imaginations must be vital, florid, healthy, encouraged, alive, and in every way supported. When we pour images into them, something else is happening, really. We're kind of being abused in a way. Our imagination is being abused, even if the images are very beautiful. You know, to relate with a single image is one thing. To relate with a group of images is another. To relate with a flowing torrent of imagery is something else entirely. And I think it damages us. It also damages us not to have the experience of making images in our minds, not to be encouraged into, drawn into, invited into this wonderfully profound experience, which is not the idea of just making things up, making up pretty pictures. No, in fact, it's the basis of faculties so shocking that were we to actually have any direct understanding of their power, it would shatter our civilizations, destroy science, and erase our religions. That's why it's being hidden. Not because it's just your imagination, or because it's silly, or because it's just madness, or any of those excuses. No, it's being hidden because it's dangerous. And so they want to stifle it and control it and co-opt it so that you can only be fed images instead of making them. Just like that you can only be fed incredibly intelligent wisdom quotations instead of making them or surpassing them or coming up with something so astonishing yourself that it silences the whole collection of wisdom quotations you will ever come across, which is what you've got in you, but is being denied by this incessant copying we're doing. In fact, there are even now images of quotations, so it's no longer text, you make images of quotations. And if people want to hide viral content, if they want to circulate a virus, especially one that uses fear to get copied, to decrease its chance of being parsed, because if it's written in text, you can just copy part of that text, paste that into Google, do a quick search for hoaxes, and see if the fear-mongering has been outed as a hoax or not. Well, to hide that, to make it harder to vet viral media, people put the viral information in text that is in an image, or they also put quotations in images, which, by the way, take up a lot more data space than a text record. In many cases, 10 or sometimes even 1,000 times more, 1,000% more than a rate if you just put the quote in text. And we do have to store all these images. I'm going to get to that as we proceed, because there's some astonishing ramifications there. Now, we become what we do. And one of the choices when we're faced with beauty, learning, or a challenge is recording. The other choice is transcendence. In other words, keep going forward. Don't stop here. Don't stop to record. Go all the way through, all the way in. When we walk around with cameras, and I now commonly see people walking around following their hands, following a little box in their hands around, it's very confusing and frightening. And of course, they're commonly taking pictures and transmitting those pictures all over the place, and maybe videos and other forms of media. And they're manipulating those pictures and doing all kinds of things with them. They're relating with those pictures a lot. And they all have image banks in their computers that they have to back up, and if they lose those image banks, they will be very frightened, confused, hurt. People will spend lots of money to recover or sustain them, I know, because people have spent thousands of dollars to have me recover their image banks. In short, we spend a lot of attention on making, transmitting, storing, backing up, sharing, manipulating, talking about, liking, attending, unliking, disliking, reporting, suspecting, reacting to photographs and videos, but I'm mainly talking here about photographs. A lot of time and a lot of energy. Well, how much energy? It's really interesting. So first I want to consider the attention, the human attention that is lost. And what would we do with all of the attention that the percentage of 7 billion people on Earth, let's say it's, let's say 40% of those people are daily engaged in photographing things with their cell phones. 40%? It seem reasonable? I don't think that's too hyperbolic. So if 40% of those 7 billion people are consistently engaged throughout the day, either in relating with or taking and storing and transmitting photographs, what's the attentional cost? What can we do with all that human attention that isn't photographing and making electronic la-la lands with all those photographs? What can we do? All that. Now, I'm not trying to say we should get rid of photography, by the way, or even that we shouldn't have images. I'm saying it's crucially important that we examine our relationships with them, because we're in danger. We're making terrible mistakes. We're making mistakes that are really unthinkably confused, and we need to at least start to see some of those together. So could we take all the attention, or let's take some percentage of it. Could we take 20% of all that attention that we're spending daily on images and spend it somewhere else? What would we get? We could spend it on education. We could spend it on each other. We could spend it on intimacy, on learning about ourselves, on learning about nature, on rescuing ourselves from the incredibly confusing nightmare of damage and destruction that we're undergoing with our relationships with nature and other living things right now. We could spend it in a lot of very different ways that would, over a very short time, reap astonishing benefits, self-magnifying benefits, in fact. Whereas what we've got in our relationship with photography is a time sink. It's going to require more and more time, more and more energy, more and more attention each time we attend it. And as we attend it, we are becoming what we're doing. In other words, our minds become what we do with them. So the more that we make, attend, like, and transmit images, the more our minds become, our brains actually, adjust their structure, because they realize that this is the important thing. So they just start changing. And that's not the kind of imagination you want to have. You don't want to be a manipulator of images and a recipient of torrents of images, because, as we've been talking about, the imagination is a faculty that prospers much like a teacup does. It needs to be empty. Its nature has to be clear, and then we should fill it from within rather than without. It's a very peculiar kind of teacup, I guess. We should have the common experience of activating and transforming our minds with the imagination as a vital, living force within our souls and our hearts and our experiences. We're getting the opposite. Okay? We're getting sold images. We're getting pounded with them. They're being enforced on us from without. And that's a significant problem in a lot of different ways. The attention that we're spending on them has a catastrophic cost, because, like the positive results we could get if we invested that attention elsewhere, the negative results are self-magnifying over time. Those deficits become greater and greater and more demanding. When faced again with something beautiful or the chance to learn or grow, if we make the choice to record rather than to proceed, we're going to turn backward, freeze everything, and start spending energy to preserve, transmit, talk about, revere, and attend it, while living beings inside and around us die, actually. I'll tell you, quite honestly, people's image banks are more important than people. They're more important than nature. They're more important in many cases than their children. And although they may not recognize it directly, those image banks can get them killed. They can destroy their lives. They can get their children killed. The time that we spend attending images, serving these banks of thousands of images or hundreds of images that we've made, worrying about them, attending them, liking them, transmitting them, backing them up, tracking them, studying them as a species, right? We're doing this huge thing. And then we've got like the NSA, which now has to track and store and also examine every single image for evidence of code inclusion by quote-unquote terrorists. There's a mode called steganography where you include information inside images. And then so images are just getting poured into the electronic data space at an unthinkable rate. We've got billions of people photographing constantly. I have no idea how to even hope to calculate the number of images we're generating per day. But I know some very basic things about humans. We become really very attached to our collections. And I've had people spend incredible amounts of money to protect or restore data collections where right next to them a living being is dying, and they're not doing anything about that. Or a living being is suffering or is deprived of attention, food, care, love, joy, hope, their own assets, or is enslaved. But and our image banks are getting well attended, believe me. We are giving them everything they need to grow and prosper, while our children, our nation, our environment, and our intelligence are being laid waste to. The things we are photographing are being destroyed by photographing them. And this is part of what I've been desperate to talk about and get people to just start thinking about. Again, I don't want us to stop having photography. I don't want to say photography is evil or anything like that. Language is the same kind of problem. We've got desperate problems with how we relate with language. We can't get rid of it. But it is absolutely incumbent upon us to discover the dangers and also the hidden opportunities that arise if we address those dangers. That's what my goal is here. Not to necessarily vilify image making, but we do need to realize that, again, our imaginations are delicate. They need nurturance, not a pounding. And that nurturance involves the elicitation and development of their myriad faculties, some of which are so astonishing that they would destroy our culture, our religion, and our science. That's why I'm really concerned. The other reason I'm concerned is we have to store and transmit all these images and videos and all of that stuff. And that takes electricity. Now, moving electricity costs living beings, all kinds of them. Humans, it costs forests, it costs the oceans, it costs everything. Electricity isn't free, and we think that because all of these electronic images are stored, somewhere in the cloud or on hard drives in farms somewhere far away from us, that no damage is done by them. There's no cost to store or transmit them. We're dead wrong about that. In fact, as billions of people or millions of people pour images into the electronic data space daily and share them, we're creating an incredibly gigantic data store and movement problem that takes lots and lots of energy every day, which means living things die every day. And we don't know what ones, because we're not doing any of the accounting. We're just pouring images into the internet and really enjoying this a lot and liking them. Now, I make images too, as I may have mentioned, or if I didn't, both of my parents were involved in image making when I was a child. And I'm fascinated with all forms of image making. One of the more interesting things that happened to me around images was I once had the privilege of working in a very high-end photographic gallery where images costing tens, hundreds, or thousands, or sometimes millions of dollars were being sold. I want you to think about that. A photograph on a piece of paper worth $500,000. And it really is just a print of a negative made by a single person who happens to be famous. And this gallery sold millions of dollars worth of artwork every year. And whenever there, I was actually a technical consultant there. I repaired their computer networks. Whenever there, I was surrounded by incredibly expensive photographs. Photographs. Yeah. A photograph worth $100,000. If I was dying outside in the street, that photograph would be preserved and I would be allowed to die. If your child your child would be allowed to die, the photograph would be preserved. We live in a world like this, but it's becoming more like this now because we're spending not just the money but the attention. So much attention, and not just the attention but the storage and the energy. And not just one time. So when you post a photograph, it gets that thing, if it gets transmitted, if it's at all popular, it's going to have a very serious cost in terms of lives over its lifetime, especially as it gets transmitted, backed up, viewed millions of times, liked, attended. We have no idea what the effect of such a thing is, and we've never even stopped to look. We need to stop and look now. Because if we only look at the electricity required to store, back up, transmit, and attend all of the photographs that we're making and sharing, just the energy necessary to do that, we need to ask what dies for that to happen, how many lives are lost per hour per photograph over time, because that number is apparently growing over time, not shrinking, and it's growing in magnitudes quickly. So it's not growing in a linear progression, it's growing in a geometric progression, like 2, 4, 6, 8, 16, 32, 64. And that progression is speeding up rather than slowing down. So we need to examine this urgently because we're wiping out the beautiful things we're photographing by photographing them, and no one is aware of this. And some of those living things that we adore and think it's great to share images of are dying because we're sharing images. I don't think we would do that. And we're also kind of dying inside because our imaginations are being damaged and they're being trained to be to the position of a consumer, which is the wrong position for our imaginations. There are problems with language and writing, but at least they invoke our personal image-making capacities, and these grow dramatically with use, and as they grow, faculties of intelligence and relation come with them naturally. So without these things, we're really hobbled, we're crippled socially, we're crippled creatively. We're going to have a hard time discovering who we are, what we are, how we came to be here, because the imagination is absolutely central to all of that. But moreover, we can't photograph everything we shop for. We can't make millions of tiny little objects that are competing with us for survival, and then photograph those and have to compete against the photographs as well. Nothing will survive that. In case it's not obvious, that's exactly what we're doing. You and me, nature, our children, our elders, everything we have lived and hoped for, are now competing against photographs for survival and development, and they are losing. They're losing. We haven't even noticed. We're not even paying attention. We just keep snapping away. It's so empowering to see those images popping up in your queue, or in your news feed, to show the badge, to the world of who you are, what you saw, what you ate, what you bought, what you think is beautiful. But what about the cost? And what's happening to our communication skills as we stop writing and stop speaking, and we're just sending each other images? What's going on there? These are questions we need to examine together now, because I think it's important at this point in our history, where we stand at the precipice of a variety of irrecoverable disasters, ecologically, relationally, intellectually, that we stop and question how we got here. And rather than just forging ahead madly, we take a moment to pause, think, rethink, reforge what we're doing, why we're doing it. It's time that we together reach for something more like intelligence than a photograph, more like transcendence than recording, more like mutuality than a museum. That's my invitation to you. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together, now and in the future, with and for each other.